As a president, as a father, and as an American, I'm here to say we need to act.
It's Barack Obama's most prominent effort yet to show he is fulfilling his promises on climate change. Is this the moment environmentalists have been waiting for? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rattansi. In his second inaugural address in January, President Obama vowed to respond to the threat of climate change, adding that a failure to do so would, quote, betray our children and future generations. His speech on Tuesday was billed as proof of the seriousness with which he took that pledge. Central to his plan to cut greenhouse gases is an attempt to place the first ever U.S. federal regulations on carbon emissions from existing power plants, and to finalize similar rules for new plants. 40% of U.S. carbon dioxide is generated by power plants. But that proposal is likely to face challenge from a hostile Congress. It will also be fiercely opposed in states that rely heavily on the coal industry. President Obama also promised to open up more U.S. land to renewable energy and work with developing countries to reduce emissions. We'll examine the details of his plan in this program. He also addressed the controversial issue of the Keystone XL pipeline, which would carry 800,000 gallons of tar sands oil every day from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. Construction of the pipeline still awaits the president's approval, and environmentalists see that decision as the true test of his commitment to tackle global warming. And with me to go through the details of President Obama's climate change plan are from Sacramento, California, Daniel Nuccitelli. He's an environmental scientist and contributor to The Guardian newspaper. And from San Francisco, media campaigner Daniel Kessler, who works with 350.org to build a global grassroots movement to solve the climate crisis, focusing specifically on Keystone XL, which we will get into in a moment. But by and large, this speech has been welcomed in a lot of quarters, and a lot of concepts and proposals which we'll analyze now. But let's begin with President Obama's starting point, which was this defense of both his and the US's record on climate change over the last few years.
For the first time in 18 years, America's poised to produce more of our own oil than we buy from other nations. And today we produce more natural gas than anybody else. So we're producing energy. And these advances have grown our economy. They've created new jobs that can't be shipped overseas. And, by the way, they've also helped drive our carbon pollution to its lowest levels in nearly 20 years. Since 2006, no country on Earth has reduced its total carbon pollution by as much as the United States of America.
Dana Nuccitelli, I wonder, though, whether that, at the beginning of the speech, revealed a fundamental flaw not just in the speech, but in the entire approach to climate change. Is it possible to address climate change, save the planet, while exploiting your carbon resources as never before?
Well, it was a little bit strange that he talked about our exploitation of our oil and natural gas, and then segued onto our greenhouse gas emissions reductions, because the two don't really relate to each other very well. You know, more oil, more natural gas generally means more greenhouse gas emissions. Although at least with natural gas, if you're replacing a coal power plant with a natural gas power plant, it is a reduction in carbon emissions. So in that sense, it is an improvement, but the all of the above approach isn't the best way to reduce overall greenhouse gas emissions. Ideally, you would get as much renewable energy implemented as possible.
Right, and so I think he was referring to natural gas replacing coal, and actually he went on to talk about how it was possible to exploit that natural gas in a clean manner. Here's what he had to say.
We should strengthen our position as the top natural gas producer because, in the medium term at least, it not only can provide safe, cheap power, but it can also help reduce our carbon emissions. Federally supported technology has helped our businesses drill more effectively and extract more gas. And now we'll keep working with the industry to make drilling safer and cleaner
Daniel Kessler, I mean, clearly there has to be some stepping stone towards more renewable energy usage, but there's always that suspicion that perhaps the focus is more on natural gas and this idea of clean fracking, actually. Is that scientifically supportable? And if it is, then what's the incentive not to just carry on with that and not move on to renewable gas and renewable energy?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The more we start to rely on natural gas, the more that's going to crowd out renewables from the energy market, and that is a very, very large problem. You know, people talk about natural gas like it's going to be a bridge to the future, but if we're not careful, it's going to be a bridge, or excuse me, it's going to lead us right into a ditch. You know, the main problem with fracking is that not just that, I mean, a lot of it is on public lands, but a tremendous amount of it is on privately held lands, and they're doing this in people's backyards, and we don't really know yet what the consequences are going to be. Some of the chemicals that they use have contaminated large water supplies, and the studies and the science isn't necessarily in yet. The other part of the equation is that there's a growing climate movement in this country that's coming together to support the president on his ambitious climate goals, but fracturing that movement by telling the people who are working against fracking, look, we don't need you and you don't really count, that's not going to be a recipe for building a cohesive and powerful climate movement. We need everybody on board pushing for renewables and saying leave fossil fuels in the ground.
You don't think that's the point, though? Maybe that's part of the plan, though, is to divide and divide this very potent constituency in his base, no less. Dana?
Yeah, I mean, at least with natural gas, I mean, there are some big question marks with it, especially, you know, the possibility of groundwater pollution with fracking. And there's also a question mark how much methane is released just during drilling for leakage. So, you know, it is viewed as a possible bridge from coal to renewable energy, but the question is, how short is that bridge? I mean,
Right.
if we rely too much on building new natural gas power plants, those power plants are around for a long time. And so it could, as Daniel said, it could crowd out renewable energy. And so there are some big question marks associated with natural gas that have some people worried about relying on it too heavily.
Well, you mentioned power plants. So this was then the big moment, though, which I think everyone welcomes, or at least everyone who believes in climate change welcomes. Instituting the first federal regulations on carbon emissions from new and existing power plants. Here's that bit of the speech.
Today, about 40% of America's carbon pollution comes from our power plants. But here's the thing, right now, there are no federal limits to the amount of carbon pollution that those plants can pump into our air. None. Zero. We limit the amount of toxic chemicals like mercury and sulfur and arsenic in our air or our water, but power plants can still dump unlimited amounts of carbon pollution into the air for free. That's not right, that's not safe, and it needs to stop.
So, Daniel Nuccitelli, I mean, this is a big deal. I suppose it's never a bad idea to remind everyone that, in fact, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the government are legally mandated to act in this manner.
Right. So, I mean, it's important to bear in mind that there's only so much the president can do to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions because it's Congress that passes laws. But in 1970, the Congress passed the Clean Air Act, which says that basically the EPA has to regulate emissions of pollutants. And a couple years ago, the EPA determined, along with the Supreme Court, they determined that greenhouse gases do qualify as pollutants. And so under the Clean Air Act, they are required to regulate emissions from power plants and from vehicles. And so really all they were doing, these greenhouse gas emissions regulations are basically just implementing the law, but it's still a big deal that they're doing it. They're not dragging their feet. They're not delaying, as the previous administration, the Bush administration, they did drag their feet and really tried to delay these regulations as much as possible.
All right, and so we have this time frame that's been spelled out in the plan, Daniel. Future power plants, the proposals should be released by September 2013. As far as existing power plants are concerned, we'll have proposals by June of 2014, issuance of standards by June of 2015, implementation plans by states by June 30th, 2016. Is that a timetable that satisfies you?
It does. The U.S. has a goal of reducing our carbon emissions 17% by 2020 relative to 2005 levels. And if we institute the carbon regulations on coal plants within the time frame that the president outlined, we should be able to meet our obligations and our goals. People shouldn't sleep on the importance of these regulations. Environmentalists have been calling for this for literally decades. We have over 600 coal plants in this country. Many of them are ancient. These are using last century's technology. They poison local communities. They run on one of the world's dirtiest fuels, which is coal. And the time is long past to close these guys down. And Obama took a very serious step forward today, so the U.S. can do that.
Dana, though, nonetheless, though, despite the legal requirement to act on these emission standards, we are expecting challenges both from Congress and indeed I think lawsuits already filed by coal companies and others. I mean, so what chances there of all this being scuppered by those sorts of by that sort of opposition?
I mean, I'm sure there will be a lot of legal challenges, but in 2007, the Supreme Court did rule that as long as the EPA determined that greenhouse gases pose a threat to public health and welfare, the EPA would be required to regulate them under the Clean Air Act. So it's already been established by a Supreme Court decision. I'm sure there will be plenty of challenges to this.
But then they'll argue, well, that was just about
up.
cars. It wasn't necessarily about power and things like that. I mean, are those the sort of arguments that we're hearing?
Well, I mean, the decision was that greenhouse gases qualify as air pollutants, and therefore under the Clean Air Act, it's both vehicles and stationary sources that have to be regulated by the EPA.
Daniel, though, I mean, it was notable that the shares in coal companies dropped on Monday, although there are a number of other factors underway right now that might have had something to do with that. But so that clearly they are a bit worried about this, or at least some investors are. Are we seeing any plans, coherent plans on the table, though, for what to do with all those workers who will lose their jobs? It's not just climate skeptics and coal industry shills who are saying, well, hang on, there is a problem here. What happens to the people who are involved in these industries, whole areas of America that are invested in this? I mean, have you seen that kind of coherent plan being put forward?
Well, we outgrow certain technologies and other technologies take their place and create new jobs. When the car was being developed, people who ran horse and buggy stands said, hey, what about us? And we went ahead and moved towards cars and built highways, and that created millions of new jobs. It's going to be the same thing when we get off of fossil fuels. When you look at the job creation in the 21st century, it's not going to be in coal plants that have been there for 40 or 50 years. It's going to be in retrofitting our buildings so they're more energy efficient. It's going to be creating huge solar farms and wind installations to power our homes and businesses and places of worship. These are the jobs of the 21st century, and we're going to need jobs.
But then, so it's what Chris Hedges talked about as sacrifice zones. These sort of areas of Pennsylvania, for example, they just become areas that are forgotten. Then, I mean, there has to be some plan, doesn't there? Shouldn't that be part of this kind of comprehensive approach there?
Absolutely. We're going to need job training programs and job placement. We're going to need to make sure that the workers that are going to be left behind aren't left behind. But we should also keep in mind that the fossil fuel industry every year is employing less and less people, because their technologies are getting more efficient. So while they say that they're these big job creators, in fact, every year they're employing less people. We should also keep in mind that the fossil fuel company barons really make the lion's share of the profit here. Rex Tillerson, who runs ExxonMobil, he makes $100,000 a day. I just want to repeat that. He makes $100,000 a day. So, I don't think anyone's going to cry over the fact that his stock prices are going down.
All right, but Dana, talking about money then, throughout this speech then, there are a number of plans. $8 billion in loan guarantees are apparently now on the table for new technology. But what about the money for mitigation projects, which was discussed in this speech, to make sure that we can handle what now appear to be the inevitable effects of climate change, jobs, alternative training, things like that? Are you seeing that money being put forward?
I mean, I think that was a smart part of the plan to include not just steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also to adapt to the climate changes that are going to come. Because there's already some climate change that's happened, there's some climate change that's going to still happen. There's a question of how much, depending on how much we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, but there's certainly going to be more changes, there's going to be more extreme weather. And so it's an important and it's a smart step that part of the plan involves, improving our infrastructure, getting ready for stronger hurricanes hitting the coasts, and that sort of thing. So I'm glad that was part of the plan. That was a smart move.
Right, but that might take Congress, though, right? I mean, to pay for some of this stuff.
That'll probably take some congressional appropriations of the money, that's true.
All right, well, let's go on to Keystone.
Can I?
Yes, Daniel, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to add on to that. One of the missing pieces that isn't talked about enough when it comes to talk about the economic consequences of transitioning to fossil fuels is the fact that climate change is already costing our economy tens of billions of dollars. There's the public health part of dealing with refinery communities and coal plant communities. But when we're talking about mitigation and adaptation, dealing with the effects of climate change are, like I said, in the billions. New York City just approved an adaptation plan that's costing the city $20 billion. And that's because they're going to have to deal with tremendous sea level rise. So we know what the costs of inaction are, and they're going to be much more than the cost of action.
All right, so let's get on to Keystone. Daniel, it's been long suggested that President Obama would unveil marvelous, ambitious targets for emissions targets for power plants as a kind of quid pro quo, and then kind of say, okay, well, Keystone can go ahead. But anyway, let's hear what he had to say specifically about Keystone.
I do want to be clear. Allowing the Keystone pipeline to be built requires a finding that doing so would be in our nation's interest. And our national interest will be served only if this project does not significantly exacerbate the problem of carbon pollution. The net effects of the pipeline's impact on our climate will be absolutely critical to determining whether this project is allowed to go forward.
All right, Daniel Kessler of 350.org, spearheading the campaign against Keystone. What's your response to that?
Well, I'm sitting here trying to suppress a gigantic smile. On the surprise scale of 1 to 10, I guess that's about a 15 for me. I really didn't expect the president to address Keystone today. It's been on a sort of separate track from dealing with coal plants. But under the president's criteria that he laid out today, there is no way that he possibly could approve the Keystone pipeline, because we know that the pipeline is going to increase our greenhouse gas emissions. That's what it does by definition, and that's what the industry wants it for. They want it to open up the tar sands to huge amounts of development that's going to increase greenhouse gas emissions. So I would say what the president announced today is essentially a rejection of the pipeline.
All right, but Dana, I mean, this is where those of, I mean, I don't want to, I mean, that was such a lovely thing for Daniel to say, and it's very rare that you hear such optimism. But there is that small print, though. The State Department already came out with its much criticized review, which did determine that Keystone won't increase net carbon emissions. I mean, the general argument is usually, well, look, the Canadians are going to do it anyway. That oil will destroy the atmosphere anyway, or in some way or another. It's not going to make a difference if this pipeline is built. Isn't there that wiggle room in what the President Obama said?
That wiggle room definitely has me worried. As you say, the State Department report's been heavily criticized. Basically, their assumption is that if the Keystone pipeline isn't built, then trains will be able to pick up the slack on the oil transportation, and so it won't make a difference in the net, or at least not a significant difference, as the wording the president used, in the net greenhouse gas emissions. There are some issues with that report. The assumption that trains can pick up the slack is really dubious. The report was written by a contractor that may benefit from Keystone being built, and so there's some question whether they have a conflict of interest in writing that. So, on the one hand, I agree with Daniel that I don't buy the argument that Keystone can possibly not increase greenhouse gas emissions, but the president's wording worries me that he might be using that wiggle room based in using that State Department report to potentially okay Keystone down the line. We'll see. It's an open question.
Daniel, wiggle room, not concerned?
I don't think so. I mean, we've seen a couple of interesting things going on here. The Keystone fight has sparked the largest movement on really any environmental issue in a generation. And the president, with his ambitious climate plan, is going to need those Keystone activists, who are really climate activists, or many of them are climate activists, to support his agenda. And he can now, it doesn't make any sense for him to take these 2 steps forward with this ambitious plan today, they announced today, and then take 2 steps back by approving Keystone. And I think when you look at the criteria he laid out, that he won't approve it if it increases emissions, that means that he has to deny it, because the industry, environmentalists, really any impartial observer, all say that this is going to lead to increased greenhouse gas emissions.
Very briefly, though, Dana, if President Obama does give the go-ahead to Keystone, can he still ever claim to have a positive environmental legacy?
It'll be very difficult, because Keystone is a really large and it's really an untapped source of unconventional greenhouse gases. So opening that up with Keystone Pipeline would be a big problem.
All right, well, let's move to the international context. Another part of this then was to take international leadership on climate change. Here's what President Obama had to say.
And make no mistake, the world still looks to America to lead. And we have to all shoulder the responsibility for keeping the planet habitable, or we're going to suffer the consequences together. So to help more countries transitioning to cleaner sources of energy and to help them do it faster, we're going to partner with our private sector to apply private sector technological know-how in countries that transition to natural gas. We've mobilized billions of dollars in private capital for clean energy projects around the world. Today, I'm calling for an end of public financing for new coal plants overseas, unless they deploy carbon capture technologies or there's no other viable way for the poorest countries to generate electricity. And I urge other countries to join this effort. And I'm directing my administration to launch negotiations toward global free trade in environmental goods and services, including clean energy technology, to help more countries skip past the dirty phase of development and join a global low-carbon economy.
All right, a lot there. We only have about 3 minutes left, so we're going to have to whiz through this. Dana, first of all, as far as international climate leadership is concerned, the U.S. is usually presented as the power that's stymieing that. Do we expect some sort of change now?
I mean, it sounds like President Obama is moving in that direction and trying to actually become a leader on climate change as opposed to a country that's dragging our feet. So that is an encouraging sign, and I hope he follows through with that. It sounds like he will.
But what about this idea of a global free trade in environmental goods and services? And when you look actually at the small print of the plan, it's very much tied to the World Trade Organization. Daniel, I mean, is this plan completely clear? Is it tied to other economic objectives, other neoliberal economic structural adjustment objectives, perhaps? I mean, is there a price to pay here?
Yeah, I mean, there's always a price to pay. This is going to be extremely tricky, and I hope the administration is up to it. I think that they probably are. There's a lot of smart people around the world who are really committed to making a system like this work, and it has to work because when you're looking at developing countries, they're going to need some help. And we're going to need the right systems to set up to help them. And it was really encouraging to hear the president talk about it.
But he's doing that within the framework of the WTO and other neoliberal institutions, which actually many in the developing world say not only make them pay a very heavy price democratically and economically, but also contributing to the environmental degradation of the planet. Dana.
Yeah, I mean, there are some concerns there, but at least it's positive to hear President Obama talking about helping developing countries move away from coal and toward cleaner sources of energy. So the framework might be a bit of a concern, but at least the idea is a good one.
All right, well, that's another interesting question. Is he helping them move away from coal, Daniel? Because then he's talking about carbon capture and clean coal and technologies like this, which actually, frankly, not that many environmental scientists believe much in.
Yeah, that's why I'm not really. He talks about stuff like that to give a little head nod to that industry, and he does throw some money their way, but it's never going to happen. We're never going to have widespread carbon capture technology. The technology is not ready. It's too expensive. And renewables are getting cheaper every day, so it doesn't make any sense to invest in that, and I think we're going to see that renewables are going to win the day.
Right, but Dana, I mean, there is that, again, there's that suggestion there that you can have a kind of normalization of the climate emergency, that you can keep the entire global economic system in place and save the planet at the same time. And you do wonder whether, without actually addressing what is perhaps that fundamental contradiction, again, like drill baby drilling and also meeting the US's objectives, it's not going to work.
I agree, but I agree with Daniel that I think he's just saying that to reassure the coal industry and reassure people that it's not going to be too difficult. But in reality, I mean, if he says we're not going to fund coal plants unless they have carbon capture and storage, well, they're not going to have carbon capture and storage, and so they're not going to get funded. And so it's going to have to be natural gas or renewable, or preferably renewable energy that gets funded. We'll
keep an eye on the small print. Dana Nuccitelli, thank you very much. Nuccitelli, rather, thank you very much. Daniel Kessler, thank you very much as well. And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Share ideas with us on Twitter. Our handle is AJ Inside Story AM.